As we move into the 20th century with regards to Western world and the Western civilization, we need to take a look at what we call the intellectual developments going on at this time. One of the things that we learn in history is that what people are focused in on intellectually will drive history. For example, right now, one of the biggest things in our modern era has been the rise of the political correct movement. This is an intellectual development that happened, and it has been driving the late 20th century, but especially the 21st century with regards to the world, history, political events. And so we're going to take a look at some of the intellectual developments that are going to drive the 20th century. And these developed during the period of the late 1800s, early 1900s. And there's a few things that we need to talk about here. One of those is, oh, by the way, all of this is on the PowerPoints under intellectual developments. So if you want to pull those up and follow along. One of the things that developed in this period was the rise of communism. Communism is a political, social, economic belief system that basically says that all wealth should be equally shared amongst everyone, not based on private enterprise, not based on private businesses, not based on personal involvement. But the idea behind it is that the government owns the major corporations, and under true communism, the government basically owns all businesses and corporations, and there is no private property. The communist movement really gets her feet with Karl Marx. Karl Marx wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto. It was released in the mid 1800s, but it really began to take off in the early 20th century. And it talked a lot about the proletariat or the working class rising up, throwing off the bourgeois, the newly wealthy, and basically throwing them out of their environments and taking that money and having it redistributed to everyone. Communism is based on the ideology of revolution, that you do not have true communism that takes place, and then unless there's a revolution from the working people, from the lowest classes, rising up against the wealthy. And communism began to form and really get some feet underneath her in the early 20th century, especially once Russia became the Soviet Union and became a communist nation. One of the things that is wrapped up also in communism is the idea of worldwide revolution. And this is that it should not only be one nation that becomes communist, but that this should spread amongst all nations. And so the idea behind that is that if you have one nation that becomes communist, then her neighbor will become communist, and the neighbor over here will become communist, and this revolution would take place around the world. Um, Agitating for revolution is a big part of the move into communism, as well as turning the social classes against one another, turning the poor against the wealthy, turning the working class against the management. All of these become part of the DNA of the communist movement. And that's going to shape the 20th century and also shape today very much. Another one of the intellectual developments that happened is centered around the theory of evolution that was proposed by Charles Darwin. Now, we all know that evolution is within the biological sphere. But one of the things that happened is a couple of sociologists took Darwinism, evolution, the idea of the survival of the fittest, the idea of the struggle for survival, the idea of adaptation to the environment, allowing the weak basically to die out and the strong to survive. Some sociologists took those ideas and moved them into society. And this became known as social Darwinism. And social Darwinism is basically where you take that approach of the strongest will survive, the approach of natural selection, that only certain businesses and only certain nations and only certain groups of people will be able to make it. And those should be the ones that should make it, and the rest should be allowed to die out. This is going to give rise to imperialism as we watch stronger nations begin to conquer smaller nations in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because of that idea that we are more evolved as a stronger nation. The weak should be swallowed up, basically, that they don't have good footing to be able to stand on. But it's also going to lead to the development of what's called eugenics. And eugenics is the idea that you manipulate the human race so that only certain groups of people reproduce. Only the strong reproduce, only the successful reproduce, only those that are considered attractive with regards to adaptability reproduce. And with this, eugenics movement is going to come a couple of streams. One of those is this is going to really become a kind of propulsion behind Hitler, excuse me, and the rise of Nazis with regards to having a pure race, having a race of people that are pure above everyone else. And it will legitimize, quote unquote, his desire, excuse me, to do away with or kill off the lesser races, including the Jews, including the Roma, who are the Gypsies, including the Poles, the people of Polish descent, etc. And we'll be talking more about that. But eugenics is also going to take a role here in America. And we're going to see where here in America, certain groups of people are basically not going to be allowed to reproduce because of their either ethnic background, because of physical handicap, because of some kind of mental delay with regards to development. And we actually are going to see this eugenics movement in America where thousands of people will be forcibly sterilized against their knowledge and against their will because they were deemed not worth reproducing. This also is going to help give rise to the birth control pill as we watch Margaret Sanger develop the pill basically for the purpose of allowing or not allowing those people living in the tenements to reproduce. And this is going to really focus in on the poorest of poor areas in the cities, targeting African Americans especially. And so eugenics becomes a movement that is going to say only certain people should reproduce, only certain people should be allowed to survive and thrive, and it's going to shape the 20th century as well. A couple other things that are going to shape the 20th century are some scientific discoveries, the discovery of radiation, radium, and the work on the radium atom by Madame Curie or Marie Curie is going to help lead to the development of radiation. Einstein's work with regards to splitting the atom is going to help pave the way for the atomic bomb. So you take your radiation and you take the splitting of the atom, and you are going to have the birth of the nuclear age in the 20th century as well. Friedrich Nietzsche is another one of our philosophers who really is going to shape the 20th century with regards to this idea of the Übermenschen or the supermen. This is the belief that there are certain individuals in society that are more evolved, that are more intellectually capable to lead a nation than the rest of us. And these Übermenschen, these supermen, are in essence above our laws, above the common law. They're even above morality. Hitler is going to believe he is part of the Übermenschen. We're going to have a few other leaders during the 20th century that are going to believe they're part of this elite class of people that are really above the common laws of the people, and because they're so smart and they're so evolved that they should not be held accountable the way the rest of us should. As a matter of fact, they should be allowed to create laws but then not have to live according to them. This also is going to dramatically shape the 20th century. And of course, we're going to have Freud. Sigmund Freud is going to give us psychoanalysis, which is going to be really the first time that we are going to delve into the human psyche as to why decisions are being made by people, what is behind that, We're going to see the new definitions of the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the animal instinct of a human being, the drive to survive, hunger, sex. The superego is the conscience, the morality base, and the ego is where we live. And so Freud's going to argue that we spend our time basically kind of going back and forth between the id and the superego as we seek to live our lives. And this is going to reframe the entire way that we view humans through Freudian types of lenses. Imperialism is also going to shape the early 20th century as Europe begins to gobble up basically the rest of the world. And they're going to do this for a number of reasons. One of those is social Darwinism, that idea of mother country survive strong, the desire for more natural resources, the desire to bring hygiene and development technology into these smaller nations as well. And it's going to lead to a carving up of Africa, especially. If you go through your PowerPoint, you'll see how Africa was carved up. But it's also going to lead to the rise of empires. And the British Empire is going to become one of the most prominent empires. Other European nations will also begin to carve up parts of the world and conquer them. America will get in on a little bit of this as well. So, as we move into the modern era, we need to keep in mind these kinds of lenses that the people have that are living during this time. These intellectual developments that are going on, new technology, social Darwinism, the imperialism, and all of this, communism, all of this is going to shape the 20th century.